The Horse and His Boy, Book 3 of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 11, The Unwelcome Fellow Traveler. When Shasta went through the gate, he found a slope of grass and a little heather running up before him to some trees. He had nothing to think about now and no plans to make. He had only to run, and that was quite enough. His limbs were shaking, a terrible stitch was beginning in his side, and the sweat that kept dropping into his eyes blinded them and made them smart. He was unsteady on his feet, too, and more than once he nearly turned his ankle on a loose stone. The trees were thicker now than they had been. In the more open spaces there were bracken. The sun had gone in without making it any cooler. It had become one of those hot gray days when there seemed to be twice as many flies as usual. Shasta's face was covered with them, and he didn't even try to shake them off. He had too much else to do. Suddenly he heard a horn, not a great throbbing horn like the horns of Tashbaan, but a merry call. Tree-roo-roo-to-hoo. Next moment he came into a wide glade and found himself in a crowd of people. At least it looked like a crowd to him. In reality, there were about 15 or 20 of them, all gentlemen in green hunting dresses, with their horses, some in the saddle and some standing by their horses' heads. In the center, someone was holding the stirrup for a man to mount, and the man he was holding it for was the jolliest, fat, apple-cheeked, twinkling-eyed king you could imagine. As soon as Shasta came into sight, this king forgot all about mounting his horse. He spread out his arms to Shasta, and his face lit up, and he cried out a great deep voice that seemed to come from the bottom of his chest. "Corin, my son, and on foot, and in rags, what?" "No," panted Shasta, shaking his head, "not Prince Corin. I know I'm like him. Saw his Highness in Tashbaan, sent his greetings." The king was staring at Shasta with an extraordinary expression on his face. "Are you King Loon?" gasped Shasta, and then, without waiting for an answer, "Lord King, fly, Anvard, shut the gates, enemies upon you, Radbash and 200 horses." "Have you the assurance of this, boy?" asked one of the other gentlemen. "My own eyes," said Shasta. "I've seen them, raced them all the way from Tashbaan." "On foot?" said the gentleman, raising his eyebrows a little. "Horses, with the hermit," said Shasta. "Question him no more, Darren," said King Loon. "I see truth in his face. We must ride for it, gentlemen. A spare horse there for the boy. You can ride fast, friend?" For answer, Shasta put his foot in the stirrup of the horse which had been led towards him, and a moment later he was in the saddle. He had done it 100 times with Bree in the last few weeks, and his mounting was very different now from what it had been on that first night when Bree had said that he climbed up a horse as if he were climbing a haystack. He was pleased to hear the Lord Darren say to the king, "The boy has true horseman's seat, sire. I warrant there's noble blood in him." "His blood, aye, there's the point," said the king, and he stared hard at Shasta again with that curious expression, almost a hungry expression, in his steady gray eyes. But now the whole party was moving off at a brisk canter. Shasta's seat was excellent, but he was sadly puzzled what to do with his reins, for he had never touched the reins while he was on Bree's back. But he looked very carefully out of the corners of his eyes to see what the others were doing, as some of us have done at parties when we weren't quite sure which knife or fork we were meant to use. And he tried to get his fingers right, but he didn't dare to try really directing the horse. He trusted it would follow the rest. The horse, of course, an ordinary horse, not a talking horse, but had quite wits enough to realize that a strange boy on his back had no whips and no spurs, and was not really master of the situation. That's why Shasta soon found himself at the tail end of the procession. Even so, he was going pretty fast. There were no flies now, and the air in his face was delicious. He had got his breath back, too, and his errand had succeeded. For the first time since the arrival at Tashbaan, how long ago it had seemed, he was beginning to enjoy himself. He looked up to see how much nearer the mountain tops had come. To his disappointment, he couldn't see them at all, only a vague grayness rolling down towards them. He had never been in a mountain country before, and was surprised. "It's a cloud," he said to himself, "a cloud coming down, I see. Up here in the hills one is really in the sky. I shall see what the inside of a cloud is like. What fun! I've often wondered." Far away on his left and a little behind him, the sun was getting ready to set. They had come to a rough kind of road by now and were making very good speed, but Shasta's horse was still the last of the lot. Once or twice when the road made a bend, there was now continuous forest on each side of it, he lost sight of the others for a second or two. Then they plunged into the fog, or else the fog rolled over them. The world became gray. Shasta had not realized how cold and wet the inside of a cloud would be, nor how dark. The gray turned into black with alarming speed. Someone at the head of the column winded the horn every now and then, and each time the sound came from a little farther off. He couldn't see any of the others now, but of course he'd been able to as soon as he got round the next bend. But when he rounded it, he still couldn't see them. In fact, he could see nothing at all. His horse was walking now. "Get on, horse, get on," said Shasta, and then came the horn, very faint. Bree had always told him that he must keep his heels well turned out, and Shasta had gotten the idea that something very terrible would happen if he dug his heels into the horse's sides. This seemed to him an occasion for trying it. "Look here, horse," he said, "if you don't buck up, do you know what I'll do? I'll dig my heels into you. I really will." The horse, however, took no notice of this threat, so Shasta settled himself firmly in the saddle, gripped with his knees, clenched his teeth, and punched both of the horse's sides with his heels as hard as he could. The only result was that the horse broke into a kind of pretense of a trot for 5 or 6 paces, and then subsided into a walk again. And now it was quite dark, and they seemed to have given up blowing the horn. The only sound was a steady drip-drip from the branches of the trees. "Well, I suppose even a walk will get us somewhere sometime," said Shasta to himself. "I only hope I shan't run into Rabadash and his people." He went on for what seemed a long time, always at a walking pace. He began to hate that horse, and he was also beginning to feel very hungry. Presently he came to a place where the road divided into two, and he was wondering which led to Anvard, and when he was startled by a noise from behind him. It was the noise of trotting horses. Rabadash, thought Shasta. He had no way of guessing which road Rabadash would take. "But if I take one," said Shasta to himself, "he may take the other, and if I stay at the crossroads, I'm sure to be caught." He dismounted and led his horse as quickly as he could along the right-hand road. The sound of the cavalry grew rapidly nearer, and in a minute or two Shasta realized that they were at the crossroads. He held his breath, waiting to see which way they would take. There came a low word of command, "Halt!" Then a moment of horsey noises, nostrils blowing, hoofs pawing, bits being champed, and necks being patted. Then a voice said, "Attend, all of you," it said. "We are now within a furlong of the castle. Remember your orders. Once we are in Narnia, as we soon shall be by sunrise, you are to kill as little as possible. On this venture you are to regard every drop of Narnian blood as more precious than a gallon of your own. On this venture, I say, the gods will send us a happier hour, and then you must leave nothing alive between Car Pravel and the western waste. But we are not yet in Narnia. Here in Archland it is another thing. In the assault on the castle of King Lunes, nothing matters but speed. Show your mettle. It must be mine within an hour, and if it is, I'll give it all to you. I reserve no booty for myself. Kill me every barbarian male within its walls, down to the child that was born yesterday, and everything else is yours to divide as you please. The women, the gold, the jewels, the weapons, and the wine. The man that I see hanging back when we come to the gate shall be burned alive. In the name of Tash, the irresistible, the inexorable, forward!" With a great cloppity-clop, the column began to move, and Shasta breathed again. They had taken the other road. Shasta thought they took a long time going past, for though he had been talking and thinking about the 200 horse all day, he had not realized how many there really were. But at last the sound died away, and once more he was alone amid the drip-drip from the trees. He now knew the way to Anvard, but of course he could not go there. That would only mean running into the arms of Radbash's troopers. What on earth am I to do? Said Shasta to himself. But he remounted his horse and continued along the road he had chosen, in the faint hope of finding some cottage where he might ask for shelter and a meal. He had thought, of course, of going back to Erebus and Bree and Hwin at the Hermitage, but he couldn't because now he had not the least idea of the direction. After all, said Shasta, this road is bound to get somewhere. But all that depends on what you mean by somewhere. The road kept getting on to somewhere in the sense that it got to more and more trees, all dark and dripping, and to colder and colder air. And strange icy winds kept blowing the mist past him, though they never blew it away. If he had been used to mountain country, he would have realized this meant he was now very high up, perhaps right at the top of the pass. But Shasta knew nothing about mountains. I do think, said Shasta, that I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got safe away from Tashbaan. I was left behind. Erebus and Bree and Hwin are all as snug as anything with that old hermit. Of course, I was the one who was sent on. King Lune and his people must have gotten safely to the castle and shut the gates long before Radbash arrived, but I just get left out. After being very tired and having nothing inside him, he felt so sorry for himself that the tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all this was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or somebody was walking beside him. It was pitch dark and he could see nothing, and the thing or person was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a long, very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature, and he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard long ago that there were giants in those northern countries. He bit his lip in terror, but now that he had really something to cry about, he stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope he had only imagined it. But just as he was coming quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be imagination. Anyway, he had felt the hot breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything on a breakaway and a wild gallop, but he knew he wouldn't make that horse gallop. So he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no longer. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "The one who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" asked Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I am not like the creatures you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta, after staring very hard. Then, for even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said, almost in a scream, "You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please, do go away. What harm have I ever done you? Oh, I am the unluckiest person in the whole world." Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face. "There," it said, "that is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows." Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, so he told how he had never known his real father or mother and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen. And then he told the story of his escape and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and of all their dangers in Tashbaan, and about his night among the tombs, and how the beast howled at him out of the desert. And he told about the heat and the thirst of their desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion chased them and wounded Erebus, and also how very long it was since he had had anything to eat. "I do not call you unfortunate," said the large voice. "Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" said Shasta. "There was only one lion," said the voice. What on earth do you mean? I've just told you there were at least two the first night, and there was only one, but he was swift of foot. How do you know? I was the lion. And as Shasta gasped with an open mouth and said nothing, the voice continued. I was the lion who forced you to join with Erebus. I was the cat who confronted you among the house of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you could reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat wakeful at midnight to receive you. Then it was you who wounded Erebus. It was I. But what for? Child, said the voice, I'm telling you your story, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own. Who are you? Asked Shasta. Myself, said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook, and again, myself, loud and clear and gay, and then a third time, myself, whispered so softly you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around, as if the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a new and different sort of trembling came over him, yet he felt glad too. The mist was turning from black to gray, and from gray to white. This must have begun to happen some time ago, but while he had been talking to the thing, he had not been noticing anything else. Now the whiteness around him became a shining whiteness, and his eyes began to blink. Somewhere ahead he could hear birds singing. He knew the night was over at last. He could see the mane and the ears and the head of his horse quite easily now. A golden light fell on them from the left. He thought it was the sun. He turned and saw, pacing beside him, taller than a horse, a lion. The horse did not seem to be afraid of it, or else it would not see it. It was from the lion that the light came. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful. Luckily, Shasta had lived all his life too far south in Calormen to have heard the tales of that mere whispered in Tashbaan about a dreadful Narnian demon that appeared in the form of a lion. And of course he knew none of the true stories about Aslan, the great lion, the son of the emperor over the sea, the king above all high kings in Narnia. But after one glance at the lion's face, he slipped out of the saddle and fell at his feet. He couldn't say anything, but then he didn't want to say anything, and he knew he needn't say anything. The high king above all kings stooped towards him. Its mane and some strange and solemn perfume that hung around the mane was all around him. It touched his forehead with its tongue. He lifted his face, and their eyes met. Then instantly the pale brightness of the mist and the fiery brightness of the lion rolled themselves together into a swirling glory and gathered themselves up and disappeared. He was alone with the horse on a grassy hillside under a blue sky, and there were birds singing. Chapter 12. Shasta in Narnia. Was it all a dream, wondered Shasta? But it couldn't have been a dream, for in the grass before him he saw the deep, large print of the lion's front paw. It took one's breath away to think of all the weight that could make a footprint like that, but there was something more remarkable than the size about it. As he looked at it, water had already filled the bottom of it. Soon it was full to the brim, and then overflowing, and a little stream was running downhill past him over the grass. Shasta stooped and drank, a very long drink, and then he dipped his face in and splashed his head. It was extremely cold, and clear as glass, and refreshed him very much. After that he stood up, shaking the water out of his ears and flinging the wet hair back from his forehead, and he began to take stock of his surroundings. Apparently it was still very early morning. The sun had only just risen, and it had risen out of the forest which he had saw low and far away in his right. The country which he was looking at was absolutely new to him. It was a green valley land dotted with trees, through which he caught the gleam of a river that wound away roughly to the northwest. On the far side of the valley there were high and even rocky hills, but they were lower than the mountains he had seen yesterday. Then he began to guess where he was. He turned and looked behind him and saw the slope on which he was standing belonged to a range of far higher mountains. "I see," said Shasta to himself. "Those are the big mountains between Archenland and Narnia. I was on the other side of them yesterday. I must have come through the pass at night. What luck that I hit it. At least it wasn't luck at all, really. It was him. And now I'm in Narnia." He turned and unsaddled his horse and took off his bridle. "Though you are a perfectly horrid horse," he said. It took no notice of this remark and immediately began eating grass. That horse had a very low opinion of Shasta. "I wish I could eat grass," thought Shasta. "It's no good going back to Anbard. It'll be all besieged. I'd better get lower down into the valley and see if I could get anything to eat." So he went on downhill. The thick dew was cruelly cold to his bare feet, until he came to a wood. There was a kind of track running through it, and he had not followed this for many minutes when he heard a thick and rather wheezy voice saying to him, "Good morning, neighbor." Shasta looked around eagerly to find the speaker, and presently saw a small, prickly person with a dark face who had just come out from among the trees. At least, it was small for a person, but very big indeed for a hedgehog, which was what it was. "Good morning," said Shasta, "but I'm not a neighbor. In fact, I'm a stranger in these parts." "Ah," said the hedgehog inquiringly, "I've come over the mountains from Archland, you know." "Ah, Archenland," said the hedgehog, "that's a terrible long way. Never been there myself." "And I think, perhaps," said Shasta, "someone ought to be told that there's an army of savage Calormenes attacking Anbard at this very moment." "You don't say so," answered the hedgehog. "Well, think of that. And they do say that Calormen is hundreds of thousands of miles away, right at the world's end, across a great sea of sand." "It's not nearly as far as you think," said Shasta. "And oughtn't something be done about this attack on Anbard? Oughtn't your High King be told?" "Certain sure, something ought to be done about it," said the hedgehog. "But you see, I'm just on my way to bed for a good day's sleep. Hello, neighbor." The last words were addressed to an immense biscuit-colored rabbit whose head had just popped up from somewhere beside the path. The hedgehog immediately told the rabbit what it had just learned from Shasta. The rabbit agreed that this was very remarkable news, and that someone ought to tell someone about it, with a view to do something. And so it went on. Every few minutes they were joined by another creature, some from the branches overhead and some from underground houses at their feet, till the party consisted of 5 rabbits, a squirrel, 2 magpies, a goat-foot fawn, and a mouse, who all talked at the same time, and all agreed with the hedgehog. For the truth was that in that golden age when the witch and the winter had gone and Peter and the High King ruled at Carpavel, the smaller woodland people of Narnia were so safe and happy that they were getting a little careless. Presently, however, 2 or more practical people arrived in the little wood. One was a red dwarf whose name appeared to be Duffel. The other was a stag, a beautiful, lordly creature with wide, liquid eyes, dappled flanks, and legs so thin and graceful that they looked as if you could break them with 2 fingers. "Lion alive!" roared the dwarf as soon as he had heard the news. "And if that's so, why are we all standing still chattering? Enemies at Anbard! News must be sent to Carpavel at once. The army must be called out. Narnia must go to the aid of King Lune." "Ah," said the hedgehog, "but you won't find the High King at Care. He's away to the north trouncing those giants. And talking of giants, neighbors, that puts me in mind." "Who'll take our message?" interrupted the dwarf. "Anyone here got more speed than me?" "I've got speed," said the stag. "That's my message. How many Calormenes?" 200 under Prince Rapidash, and—" But the stag was already away, all 4 legs off the ground at once, and in a moment its white stern had disappeared among the remoter trees. "Wonder where he's going," said a rabbit. "He won't find the High King at Carpavel, you know." "He'll find Queen Lucy," said Duffel, "and then, hullo, what's wrong with that human? It looks pretty green. Why, I do believe it's quite faint. perhaps it's mortal hungry. When did you have a meal, youngster?" "Yesterday morning," said Shasta weakly. "Come on, then, come on," said the dwarf, at once throwing his thick little arms around Shasta's waist to support him. "Why, neighbors, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. You come with me, lad. Breakfast's better than talking." With a great deal of bustle, muttering reproaches to itself, the dwarf half led and half supported Shasta at a great speed further into the wood and a little downhill. It was a little longer walk than Shasta wanted at that moment, and his legs had begun to feel very shaky before they came out from the trees into the bare hillside. There they found a little house with a smoking chimney and an open door, and as they came to the doorway, Duffel called out, "Hey, brothers, a visitor for breakfast." And immediately, mixed with a sizzling sound, there came to Shasta a simply delightful smell. It was one he had never smelled in his life before, but I hope you have. It was, in fact, the smell of bacon and eggs and mushrooms all frying in a pan. "Mind your head, lad," said Duffel, a moment too late, for Shasta had already bashed his forehead against the low lintel of the door. "Now," continued the dwarf, "sit you down. A table's a bit low for you, but then the stool's low too. That's right. And here's porridge, and here's a jug of cream, and here's a spoon." By the time Shasta had finished his porridge, the dwarf's two brothers, whose names were Rogan and Bintlet Thumb, were putting the dish of bacon and eggs and mushrooms and the coffee pot and the hot milk and the toast on the table. It was all new and wonderful for Shasta, for Calormene food is quite different. He didn't even know what the slices of brown stuff were, for he had never seen toast before. He didn't know what the yellow soft thing they smeared on the toast was, because in Calormen you nearly always get oil instead of butter. And the house itself was quite different from the dark, frosty, fish-smelling hut of Arish, and from the pillared and carpeted halls in the palaces of Tashbaan. The roof was very low, and everything was made of wood, and there was a cuckoo clock, and a red and white checkered tablecloth, and a bowl of wild flowers, and little curtains on the thick paned windows. It was also rather troublesome to have to use dwarf cups and plates and knives and forks. This meant that helpings were very small, but then there was great many helpings, so that Shasta's plate or cup was being filled every moment, and every moment the dwarfs themselves were saying, "Butter, please," or "Another cup of coffee," or "I'd like a few more mushrooms," or "What about frying another egg or so?" And then at last they had all eaten as much as they possibly could, for three dwarfs drew lots for who could do the washing up, and Rogan was the unlucky one. Then Duffel and Bricklethumb took Shasta outside to a bench which ran against the cottage wall, and they all stretched out their legs and gave a great sigh of contentment, and the two dwarfs lit their pipes. The dew was off the grass now, and the sun was warm. Indeed, if there hadn't been a light breeze, it would have been a bit too hot. "Now, stranger," said Duffel, "I'll show you the lie of the land. You can see nearly all South Narnia from here, and we're rather proud of the view. Right away to your left, beyond those near hills, you can see the western mountains, and that round hill away to your right is called the Hill of the Stone Table. Just beyond—" But at that moment he was interrupted by a snore from Shasta, who, with his great night's journey and his excellent breakfast, had gone fast asleep. The kindly dwarf, as soon as they noticed this, began to make signs to each other not to wake him, and indeed did so much whispering and nodding and getting up and tiptoeing away that they certainly would have waked him if he had been less tired. He slept pretty well nearly all day, but woke up in time for supper. The beds in that house were all too small for him, but they made him a fine bed of heather on the floor, and he never stirred or dreamed all night. Next morning they had just finished breakfast when they heard outside a shrill, exciting sound from the outside. "Trumpets," said all the dwarfs, as they and Shasta all came running out. The trumpets sounded again, a new noise to Shasta, not huge and solemn like the horns of Tashbaan, nor gay and merry like King Loon's hunting horn, but clear and sharp and valiant. The noise was coming from the woods to the east, and soon there was a noise of horse hoofs mixed with it. A moment later the head of the column came into sight. First came the Lord Paradan on a bay horse, carrying the great banner of Narnia, a red lion on a green ground. Shasta knew him at once. Then 3 people came abreast, 2 on great chargers and 1 on a pony. The 2 on the chargers were King Edmund and a fair-haired lady with a very merry face, who wore a helmet and a mail shirt, and carried a low bow across her shoulders and a quiver full of arrows at her side. "The Queen Lucy," whispered Duffel. But the one on the pony was Corin. After that came the main body of the army, men in ordinary horses, men on talking horses, who didn't mind being ridden on proper occasions, as when Narnia went to war. Centaurs, stern, hard-bitten bears, great talking dogs, and at last of all 6 giants, for there are good giants in Narnia. But though he knew they were on the right side, Shasta at first could hardly bear to look at them. There were some things that take a lot of getting used to. Just as the king and queen reached the cottage and the dwarfs began making low bows to them, King Edmund called out, "Now, friends, time for a halt and a morsel." And at once there was a great bustle of people dismounting, and haversacks being opened, and conversations beginning, when Corin came running up to Shasta and seized both his hands and cried, "What? You here? So you got through all right. I am glad. Now we shall have some sport, and isn't it luck? We only got into the harbor at Carpavel yesterday morning, and the very first person who met us was Servy the stag, with this news of an attack on Anvard. Don't you think?" "Who's your highness's friend?" said King Edmund, who had just gotten off his horse. "Don't you see, sir?" said Corin. "It's my double, the boy you mistook me for at Tashbaan." "Why, so he is your double!" exclaimed Queen Lucy. "As like as 2 twins. This is a marvelous thing." "Please your majesty," said Shasta to King Edmund, "I was no traitor, really I wasn't, and I couldn't help hearing your plans, but I'd never have dreamed of telling them to your enemies." "I know now that you were no traitor, boy," said King Edmund, laying his head on Shasta's head, "but if you would not be taken for one another time, try not to hear what's meant for other ears. Be all's well." After that there was so much bustle and talk and coming and going that Shasta for a few minutes lost sight of Corin and Edmund and Lucy. But Corin was the sort of boy whom one is sure to hear of pretty soon, and it wasn't very long before Shasta heard King Edmund saying in a loud voice, "By the lion's mane, Prince, this is too much. Will your highness never be better? You are more of a heart-scald than our whole army together. I've a leaf of regretment of hornets in my command as you." Shasta wormed his way through the crowd and saw there Edmund looking very angry indeed, Corin looking a little ashamed of himself, and a strange dwarf sitting on the ground making faces. A couple of fawns had apparently just been helping it out of its armor. "If I hadn't but my cordial with me," Queen Lucy was saying, "I could soon mend this, but the High King has so strictly charged me not to carry it commonly to the wars, and to keep it only for great extremities." What had happened was this. As soon as Corin had spoken to Shasta, Corin's elbow had been plucked by a dwarf in the army called Thornbutt. "But what is it, Thornbutt?" Corin had said. "Your Royal Highness," said Thornbutt, drawing him aside, "our march today will bring us through the pass and right to your royal father's castle. We may be in battle before the night." "I know," said Corin. "Isn't it splendid?" "Splendid or not," said Thornbutt, "I have the strictest orders from King Edmund to see to that your highness is not in the fight. You will be allowed to see it, and that's treat enough for your highness's little years." "Oh, what nonsense!" Corin burst out. "Of course I'm going to fight. Why, the Queen Lucy's going to be there with the archers." "The Queen's Grace will do as she pleases," said Thornbutt, "but you are in my charge. Either I must have your solemn and princely word that you will keep your pony beside mine, not half a neck ahead, till I give your highness leave to depart, or else, it is his majesty's word, we must go with our wrists tied together like 2 prisoners. "I'll knock you down if you try to bind me," said Corin. "I'd like to see your highness do it," said the dwarf. And that was quite enough for a boy like Corin, and in a second he and the dwarf were at it as hammer and tongs. It would have been even a match for, though Corin had longer arms and more height, the dwarf was older and tougher. But it was never fought out. That's the worst of the fights on a rough hillside. For by very bad luck Thornbutt trod on a loose stone, came flat down on his nose, and found, when he tried to get up, that he had sprained his ankle, a real excruciating sprain which could keep him from walking or riding, at least for a fortnight. "See what your highness has done," said King Edmund, "deprived us of a proved warrior on the very edge of battle." "I'll take his place, sir," said Corin. "Pshaw," said Edmund, "no one doubts your courage, but a boy in a battle is a danger only to his own side." At that moment the king was called away to attend to something else, and Corin, after apologizing handsomely to the dwarf, rushed up to Shasta and whispered, "Quick, there's a spare pony now, and the dwarf's armor. Put it on before anyone notices." "What for?" said Shasta. "Why, so that you and I can fight in the battle, of course. Don't you want to?" Yes, of course," said Shasta, but he hadn't been thinking of doing it all, and he began to get a most uncomfortable prickly feeling in his spine. "That's right," said Corin, "over your head. Now the sword belt. But we must ride near the tail of the column and keep quiet as mice. Once the battle begins, everyone will be far too busy to notice us." Chapter 13. The Fight at Anvard. About 11 o'clock the whole company was once more on the march, riding westward with the mountains on their left. Corin and Shasta rode right at the rear with the giants immediately in front of them. Lucy and Edmund and Peredan were busy with their plans for the battle, and though Lucy once said, "But where is his Glooskap Highness?" Edmund only replied, "Not in the front, and that's good news enough. Leave well alone." Shasta told Corin most of his adventures, and explained that he had learned all his riding from a horse and didn't really know how to use the reins. Corin instructed him in this, besides telling him all about their secret sailing from Tashbaan. "And where is the Queen Susan?" "At Cair Paravel," said Corin. "She's not like Lucy, you know, who's as good as a man, or at any rate as good as a boy. Queen Susan is more like an ordinary grown-up lady. She doesn't ride to the wars, though she is an excellent archer." The hillside path, which they were following, became narrower all the time, and at the drop their right hand became steeper. At last they were going in single file along the edge of the precipice, and Shasta shuddered to think that he had done the same last night without knowing it. But of course, he thought, I was quite safe. That is why the lion kept on my left. He was between me and the edge all the time. Then the path went left and south away from the cliff, and there were thick woods on both sides of it, and they went steeply up and up to the pass. There would have been a splendid view from the top if it were open ground, but among all those trees you could see nothing. Only, every now and then, some huge pinnacle of rock above the treetops, and an eagle or two wheeling high up in the blue air. "They smell battle," said Corin, pointing at the birds. "They know we're preparing a feed for them." Shasta didn't like this at all. When they had crossed the neck of the pass and come a good deal lower, they reached more open ground, and from here Shasta could see all of Archland, blue and hazy, spread out below him, and even, he thought, a hint of the desert beyond it. But the sun, which had perhaps 2 hours or so to go before it set, was in his eyes, and he couldn't make things quite out distinctly. Here the army halted and spread out in a line, and there was a great deal of rearranging. A whole detachment of very dangerous-looking talking beasts, whom Shasta had not noticed before, and who were mostly of the cat kind, leopards, panthers, and the like, went padding and growling to take up their positions on the left. The giants were ordered to the right, and before going there they all took off something they had been carrying on their backs and sat down for a moment. Then Shasta saw what they had been carrying, and they were now putting on were pairs of boots, horrid heavy spiked boots, which came up to their knees. Then they sloped their huge clubs over their shoulders and marched to their battle positions. The archers with Queen Lucy fell into the rear, and you could see them bending their bows, and then hear the twang-twang as they tested the strings. and wherever you looked you could see people tightening girths, putting on helmets, drawing swords, and throwing cloaks to the ground. There was hardly any talking now. It was very solemn and very dreadful. I'm in for it now. I really am in for it now, thought Shasta. Then there came noises far ahead, the sound of many men shouting and a steady thud, thud, thud. Battering ram, whispered Corin. They're battering the gate. Even Corin looked quite serious now. Why doesn't King Edmund get on? He said. I can't stand this waiting about. Chilly, too. Shasta nodded, hoping he didn't look as frightened as he felt. The trumpet at last. On the move now trotting, the banner streaming out in the wind, and they had topped a low ridge now, and below them the whole scene suddenly opened out. A little many-towered castle with its gate towards them. No moat, unfortunately, but the course the gate shut and the porticus down. On the walls they could see, like little white dots, the faces of the defenders. Down below, about 50 of the cavalrymen dismounted, were steadily swinging a great tree trunk against the gate. But at once the scene changed. The main bulk of Radabash's men had been on foot readily to assault the gate, but now he had seen the Narnians sweeping down the ridge. There is no doubt those cavalrymen are wonderfully trained. It seemed to Shasta only a second before a whole line of the enemy were on horseback again, wheeling around to meet them, swinging towards them. And now a gallop. The ground between the two armies grew less every moment, faster and faster, all swords out now, all shields up to the nose, all prayers said, all teeth clenched. Shasta was dreadfully frightened, but it suddenly came into his head. If you funk this, you'll funk every battle all your life, now or never. When at last the two lines met, he had really very little idea of what happened. There was a frightful confusion and an appalling noise. His sword was knocked clean out of his hand pretty soon, and he got the reins tangled somehow. Then he found himself slipping. Then a spear came straight at him. As he ducked to avoid it, he rolled right off his horse, bashed his left knuckles terribly against someone else's armor, and then... But it is no use trying to describe the battle from Shasta's point of view. He understood too little of the fight in general, and even of his own part in it. The best way I can tell you is what really happened, is to take you some miles away to where the hermit of the southern march sat, gazing into the smooth pool beneath the spreading tree, with Bree and Hwin and Erebus beside him. For it was in this pool that the hermit looked when he wanted to know what was going on in the world outside the green walls of his hermitage. There, as in a mirror, he could see it, at certain times, what was going on in the streets of cities farther and farther south than Tashbaan, or what ships were putting into Redhaven in the remote Seven Isles, or what robbers or wild beasts stirred in the great western forest between Lantern Waste and Telmar. And all of his day he had hardly left his pool, even to eat or to drink, for he knew that great events were on foot in Archland. Erebus and the horses gazed into it too. They could see it was a magic pool. Instead of reflecting the trees and the sky, it revealed cloudy and coloring shapes moving, always moving in its depths. But they could see nothing clearly. The hermit could, and from time to time he told them what he saw. A little while before Shasta rode into his first battle, the hermit had begun speaking like this. I see 1, 2, 3 eagles wheeling in the gap by Stormless Head. One is the oldest of all eagles. He would not be out unless battle was at hand. I see him wheeling to and fro, peering down sometimes at Anvard, and sometimes to the east, behind Stormness. Ah, I see now what Radbash and his men have been so busy at all day. They have felled and lopped a great tree, and they are now coming out of the woods carrying it as a ram. They have learned something from the failure of last night's assault. He would have been wiser if he set his men to making ladders, but it takes too long, and he is impatient. Fool that he is. He ought to have ridden back to Tashbaan as soon as the first attack failed, for his whole plan depended on speed and surprise. Now they are bringing their ram into the position. King Loon's men are shooting hard from the walls. 5 Calormenes have fallen, but not many will. They have their shields above their heads. Rabadash is giving his orders now. With him are his most trusted lords, fierce Tarkans from the eastern province. I can see their faces. There is Corridon of Castle Tumut, Erzu and Chalmash and Ligmuth and the Twisted Lip, and a tall Tarkan with a crimson beard. By the main, my old master Andoran, said Bree. Shh, said Erebus. Now the ram has started. If I could hear as well as see, what a noise that would make. Stroke after stroke, and no gate can stand it forever. But wait. Something up by Stormness has scared the birds. They're coming out in masses. Hen, wait again. I can't see yet. Ah, now I can. The whole ridge up on the east is black with horsemen. If only the wind would catch that standard and spread it out. They're over the ridge now, whoever they are. Ah, I've seen the banner now. Narnia, Narnia. It's the Red Lion. They're in full career down on the hill now. I can see King Edmund. There's a woman behind, among the archers. Oh! What is it? Asked Twin breathlessly. All his cats are dashing out from the left of the line. Cats? Said Erebus. Great cats, leopards and such, said the hermit impatiently. I see, I see. The cats are coming round the circle to get at the horses of the dismounted men. A good stroke. The Calormene horses are mad with terror already. Now the cats are in among them. But Rabadash has reformed his line, and has taken 100 men in the saddle. They're riding to meet the Narnians. There's only 100 yards between the two lines now. Only 50. I can see King Edmund. I can see the Lord Peridon. There are 2 mere children in the Narnian line. What can the king be about to let them into the battle? Only 10 yards. The lines have met. The giants on the Narnian right are doing wonders, but one's down, shot through the eye, I suppose. The center's all a muddle. I can see more on the left. There are the 2 boys again, lying alive. One is Prince Corn, the other like him as 2 peas. It's your little Shasta. Corn is fighting like a man. He's killed the Calormene. I can see a bit of the center now. Rabadash and Edmund almost met then, but the press has separated them. What about Shasta? Said Erebus. Oh, the fool, groaned the hermit. Poor brave little fool. He knows nothing about this work. He's making no use at all of his shield. His whole side's exposed. He hasn't the faintest idea of what to do with his sword. Oh, he's remembered it now. He's waving it wildly about, nearly cut off his own pony's head, and he will in a moment if he's not careful. It's been knocked out of his hand now. It's a mere murder sending a child into the battle. He can't live 5 minutes. Duck, you fool. Oh, he's down. Killed? Asked the 3 voices breathlessly. How can I tell? Said the hermit. The cats have done their work, and all the riderless horses are dead or escaped now. No retreat for the Calormenes on them. Now the cats are turning back into the main battle. They're leaping on the ram's men. The ram is down. Oh, good, good. The gates are opening from the inside. There's going to be a sortie. The first 3 are out. It's King Loon in the middle, the brothers Dar and Darren on each side of him. Behind them are Tran and Shar and Cole with his brother Colin. There are 10, 20, nearly 30 of them out by now. The Calormene line is being forced back upon them. King Edmund is dealing marvelous strokes. He just slashed Corridon's head off. Lots of Calormenes have thrown down their arms and are running for the woods. Those that remain are hard pressed. The giants are closing in on the right, cats on the left, King Loon from the rear. The Calormenes are a little knot now, fighting back to back. Your Tarkan's down, Bree. Loon and King Azra are fighting hand to hand. The king looks like winning. The king is keeping it up well. The king has won. Azra's down. King Edmund's down. Nope, he's up again. He's at it with Rabadash. They're fighting in the very gates of the castle. Silvercal Marines have surrendered. Darren has killed Ilgameth. I can't see what's happened to Rapidash. I think he's dead, leaning against the castle wall, but I don't know. Chalmash and King Edmund are still fighting, but the battle is over everywhere else. Calmash has surrendered. The battle is over. The Cal Marines are utterly defeated. When Shasta fell off his horse, he gave himself up for lost. But horses, even in battle, tread on human beings very much less than you would suppose. After a very horrible 10 minutes or so, Shasta realized suddenly that there were no longer any horses stamping about in the immediate neighborhood, and that the noise, for there were still many good noises going on, was no longer that of battle. He sat up and stared about him. Even he, little as he knew about battles, could soon see that the Archlanders and the Narnians had won. The only living Cal Marines he could see were prisoners, and the castle gates were wide open, and King Lune and King Edmund were shaking hands across the battering rams. From the circle of the lords and the warriors around them there arose a sound of breathless and excited, but obviously cheerful conversation, and then, suddenly, it all united, and swelled into a great roar of laughter. Shasta picked himself up, feeling uncomfortably stiff, and ran towards the sound to see what the joke was. A very curious sight met his eyes. The unfortunate Rapidash appeared to be suspended from the castle walls. His feet, which were about 2 feet from the ground, were kicking wildly. His chain skirt was somehow hitched up so that it was horribly tight under the arms and came halfway over his face. In fact, he looked just like a man looks if you catch him in the very act of getting into a stiff shirt that is a little too small for him. And as far as could be made out afterwards, and you may be sure the story was well talked over for many a day, what had happened was something like this. Early in the battle, one of the giants had made an unsuccessful stamp at Rapidash with his spiked boot. Unsuccessful because it didn't crush Rapidash, which was what the giant had intended, but not quite useless because one of the spikes tore the chainmail, just as you or I might tear an ordinary shirt. So Rapidash, by the time he encountered Edmund at the gate, had a hole in the back of his habergeon. And when Edmund pressed him back nearer and nearer to the wall, he jumped up on a mounting block and stood there raining down blows on Edmund from above. But then, finding that position by raising him above the heads of everyone else, he made him a mark for every arrow for the Narnians' bows. He decided to jump down again. And he meant to look and sound, no doubt for a moment, that he did look and sound very grand and very dreadful as he jumped, crying, "The bolt of Tash falls from above." But he had to jump sideways because the crowd in front of him left him no landing place in that direction. And then, in the neatest way you could wish, the tear in the back of his habergeon caught on a hook on the wall. Ages ago this hook had a ring in it for tying horses. And there he found himself, like a piece of washing hung up to dry, with everyone laughing at him. "Let me down, Edmund," howled Rapidash. "Let me down and fight me like a king and a man. Or are you too great a coward to do that? Kill me at once." "Certainly," began King Edmund, but King Lune interrupted. "By your Majesty's good leave," said King Lune to Edmund, "not so." Then, turning to Rapidash, he said, "Your Royal Highness, if you had given that challenge a week ago, I'll answer it, for there was no one in King Edmund's dominion, from the High King down to the smallest talking mouse, that would have refused it. But by attacking our castle of Anvard in time of peace without defiance sent, you have proved yourself no knight, but a traitor, and one rather to be whipped by the hangman than to be suffered to cross swords with any person of honor. Take him down, bind him, and carry him within, till our pleasure is further known." Strong hands wrenched Rapidash's sword from him, and he was carried away into the castle, shouting, threatening, cursing, and even crying, for though he had faced torture, he couldn't bear being made ridiculous. In Tashbaan, everyone had always taken him seriously. At that moment, Corrin ran up to Shasta, seized his hand, and started dragging him towards King Lune. "Here he is, father, here he is," cried Corin. "Ay, and here thou art at last," said the king in a very gruff voice, "and hast been in the battle, clean contrary to your obedience. A boy to break a father's heart. At your age a rod to your breech would fitter than a sword to your fist. Ha!" But everyone, including Corin, could see that the king was very proud of him. "Chide him no more, sire, if you please," said Lorendarin. "His Highness would not be your son if he did not inherit your conditions. It would grieve your Majesty more if he had been reproved for the opposite fault." "Well, well," grumbled the king, "we'll pass this over for this time. And now—" What came next surprised Shasta as much as anything that had ever happened to him in his life. He found himself suddenly embraced in a bear-like hug by King Loon and kissed on both cheeks, and then the king sent him down again and said, "Stand there, boys, together, and let all the court see you. Hold up your heads, now, gentlemen. Look at them both. Has any man any doubts?" And still Shasta could not understand why everyone was staring at him and Corin, nor what all the cheering was about. Chapter 14. How Bree Became a Wiser Horse. We must now return to Erebus and the horses. The hermit, watching in his pool, was able to tell them that Shasta was not killed or even seriously wounded, for he saw him get up and saw how affectionately he was greeted by King Loon. But as he could only see, not hear, he did not know what anyone was saying, and once the fighting had stopped and the talking had begun, it was not worth while looking in the pool any longer. Next morning, while the hermit was indoors, the three of them discussed what they should do next. "I've had enough of this," said Hwin. "The hermit has been very good to us, and I'm very much obliged to him, I'm sure, but I'm getting as fat as a pet pony, eating all day and getting no exercise. Let's go on to Narnia." "Oh, not today, ma'am," said Bree. "I wouldn't hurry things. Some other day, don't you think?" "We must see Shasta first and say good-bye to him, and apologize," said Erebus. "Exactly," said Bree with great enthusiasm. "Just what I was going to say." "Oh, of course," said Hwin. "I expect he's in Anvard. Naturally, we'll look in on him and say good-bye. But that's on our way, and why shouldn't we start at once? After all, I thought it was Narnia we all wanted to get to." "I suppose so," said Erebus. She was beginning to wonder what exactly she would do when she got there, and was feeling a little lonely. Of course," said Bree hastily, "but there's no need to rush things, if you know what I mean." "No, I don't know what you mean," said Hwin. "Why don't you want to go?" "Broo-hoo," muttered Bree. "Well, don't you see, ma'am? It's an important occasion, returning to one's own country, entering society, the best society. It's so essential to make a good impression, not perhaps looking quite ourselves yet, eh?" Hwin broke out into a hoarse laugh. "It's your tail, Bree. I see it all now. You want to wait till your tail's grown again, and we don't even know if tails are worn long in Narnia. Really, Bree, you're as vain as that Takarina in Tashbaan." "You are silly, Bree," said Erebus. "By the lion's mane, Tarkina, I'm nothing of the sort," said Bree indigently. "I have a proper respect for myself and for my fellow horses, that's all." "Bree," said Erebus, who was not very interested in the cut of his tail, "I've been wanting to ask you something for a long time. Why do you keep swearing by the lion, and by the lion's mane? I thought you hated lions." "So I do," answered Bree, "but when I speak of the lion, of course, I mean Aslan, the great deliverer of Narnia who drove away the witch and the winter. All Narnians swear by him." "But he is a lion?" "No, no, of course not," said Bree in a rather shocked voice. "All the stories about him in Tashbaan say he is," said Erebus, "and if he isn't a lion, why do you call him a lion?" "Well, you'd hardly understand that at your age," said Bree, "and I was only a little fool when I left, so I don't quite fully understand it myself." Bree was standing with his back to the green wall while he said this, and the other two were facing him. He was talking in rather a superior tone with his eyes half shut. That was why he didn't see the change in expression in the faces of Hwin and Erebus. They had good reason to have open mouths and staring eyes, because while Bree spoke they saw an enormous lion leap up from outside and balance itself on top of the green wall. Only it was a brighter yellow, and it was bigger and more beautiful and more alarming than any lion they had ever seen. And at once it jumped down inside the wall and began approaching Bree from behind. It made no noise at all, and Hwin and Erebus couldn't make any noise themselves, no more than if they were frozen. "No doubt," continued Bree, "when they speak of him as a lion they only mean he's as strong as a lion, or, to our enemies of course, as fierce as a lion, or something of that kind. Even a little girl like you, Erebus, must see that it would be quite absurd to suppose he is a real lion. Indeed, it would be disrespectful. If he was a lion, he'd have to be a beast just like the rest of us. Why," and here Bree began to laugh, "if he was a lion, he'd have 4 paws and a tail and whiskers. Ooh, help!" For just as he said the word whiskers, one of Aslan's had actually tickled his ear. Bree shot away like an arrow to the other side of the enclosure, and there turned, and the wall was so high for him to jump that he could fly no further. Erebus and Hwin both started back. There was about a second of intense silence. Then Hwin, though shaking all over, gave a strange little neigh and trotted across to the lion. "Please," she said, "you're so beautiful. You may eat me if you like. I'd sooner be eaten by you than fed by anyone else." "Dearest daughter," said Aslan, planting a lion's kiss on her twitching velvet nose, "I knew you would not be so long in coming to me. Joy shall be yours." And then he lifted his head and spoke in a louder voice. "Now, Bree," he said, "you poor, proud, frightened horse, draw near. Nearer still, my son. Do not dare, not to dare. Touch me, smell me. Here are my paws. Here is my tail. These are my whiskers. I am a true beast." "Aslan," said Bree in a shaken voice, "I'm afraid I must be rather a fool." Happy the horse who knows that while he is still young, or the human either. Draw near, Erebus, my daughter. See, my paws are velveted. You will not be torn this time. "This time, sir?" said Erebus. "It was I who wounded you," said Aslan. "I am the only lion you met in all your journeys. Do you know why I tore you?" "No, sir." "The scratches on your back, tear for tear, throb for throb, blood for blood, were equal to the stripes laid on the back of your stepmother's slave, because of the drugged sleep you cast upon her. You need to know what it felt like." "Yes, sir, please." "Ask on, my dear," said Aslan. "Will any more harm come to her by what I have done?" "Child," said the lion, "I am telling you your story, not hers. No one is told any story but their own." And then he shook his head and spoke in a lighter voice. "Be merry, little ones," he said. "We shall meet again soon. But before that you will have another visitor." And then one bound he'll reach the top of the wall and vanished from their sight. Strange to say, they felt no inclination to talk to one another about him after he had gone. They all moved slowly away to different parts of the quiet grass, and there paced to and fro, each alone, thinking. About half an hour later, the 2 horses were summoned to the back of the house to eat something nice that the hermit had gotten ready for them, and Erebus, still walking and thinking, was startled by the harsh sound of a trumpet outside the gate. "Who's there?" said Erebus. "His Royal Highness Prince Kor of Archland," said a voice from outside. Erebus undid the door and opened it, drawing back a little way to let the strangers in. 2 soldiers with halberds came first, and took their stand at either side of the entry. Then followed a herald and the trumpeter. "His Royal Highness Prince Kor of Archland desires an audience with the Lady of Erebus," said the herald. And then he and the trumpeter drew aside and bowed, and the soldiers saluted, and the prince himself came in. All his attendants withdrew and closed the gate behind them. The prince bowed, and was very clumsy bow, for a prince it was. Erebus curtsied in the Calormene style, which is not at all like ours, and did it very well, because of course she had been taught how. Then she looked up and saw what sort of person this prince was. She saw a mere boy. He was bareheaded, and his fair hair was encircled with a very thin band of gold, hardly thicker than a wire. His upper tunic was of white cambric, as fine as a handkerchief, so that the bright red tunic beneath it showed through. His left hand, which rested on his enameled sword hilt, was bandaged. Aravis looked twice at his face before she gasped and said, "Why, it's Shasta!" Shasta all at once turned very red and began speaking very quickly. "Look here, Aravis," he said, "I do hope you won't think I've got up like this, and the trumpeter and all, to try to impress you or to make out that I'm different or any rot of that sort, because I'd far rather have to come in on my old clothes, but they're burnt now, and my father said—" "Your father?" said Aravis. "Apparently, King Loon is my father," said Shasta. "I might really have guessed it, Corin being so like me. We were twins, you see. Oh, and my name isn't Shasta, it's Cor." "Cor is a nicer name than Shasta," said Aravis. "Brothers' names run like that in Archland," said Shasta, "or Prince Cor, as we must now call him. Like Dar and Darin, Cole and Colin, and so on." "Shasta, I mean Cor," said Aravis. "No, shut up. There's something I've got to say at once. I'm sorry I've been such a pig, but I did change before I knew you were a prince. Honestly, I did. When you went back and faced the lion." "It wasn't really going to kill you at all, that lion," said Cor. "I know," said Aravis, nodding. Both were still and solemn for a moment, as each saw that the other knew about Aslan. Suddenly Aravis remembered Cor's bandaged hand. "I say," she cried, "I forgot. You've been in battle. Is that a wound?" "A mere scratch," said Cor, using for the first time a rather lordly tone. But a moment later he burst out laughing, and said, "If you want to know the truth, it isn't a proper wound at all. I only took the skin off my knuckles, just as any clumsy fool might do without going near the battle." "Still, you were in the battle," said Aravis. "It must have been wonderful." "It wasn't at all like what I thought," said Cor. "But Cor, I mean, you haven't told me anything yet about King Loon and how he found out who you were." "Let's sit down," said Cor, "for it's rather a long story. And by the way, father's an absolute brick. I'd be just as pleased, or very nearly, at finding he's my father, even if he wasn't a king. Even though education and all sorts of horrible things are going to happen to me. But you want the story. Well, Corin and I were twins, and about a week after we were both born, apparently they took us to a wise old centaur in Narnia to be blessed or something. Now this centaur was a prophet, as good as many centaurs are. Perhaps you haven't seen any centaurs yet. There were some in the battle yesterday, most remarkable people, but I can't say I feel quite at home with them yet. I say, Aravis, there are going to be a lot of things to get used to in these northern countries." "Yes, there are," said Aravis, "but get on with the story." "As soon as he saw Corin and me, it seemed this centaur looked at me and said, 'A day will come that that boy will save Archenland from the deadliest danger in which ever she lay.' So of course my father and mother were very pleased, but there was someone present who wasn't. That was a chap called Lord Barr, who had been father's Lord's Chancellor, and apparently he'd done something wrong, bezzling or some word like that. I didn't understand that part very well. And father had to dismiss him, for nothing else was done to him, and he was allowed to go on living in Archenland. But he must have been as bad as he could be, for it came out afterwards he had been in the pay of the Tisroc, and had sent a lot of secret information to the Tashband. So as soon as he heard I was going to save Archland from a great danger, he decided I must be put out of the way. Well, he succeeded in kidnapping me, I don't exactly know how, and he rowed away down the winding Arrow to the coast. He had everything prepared, and there was a ship manned with his own followers lying ready for him, and he put it out to sea with me on board. But father got wind of it. though not quite in time, and it was after him as quickly as he could. The Lord Bar was already at sea when father reached the coast, but not out of sight, and father was embarked on one of his own warships within 20 minutes. It must have been a wonderful chase. They were 6 days following Bar's galleon, and brought her to battle on the 7th. It was a great sea fight. I heard a lot about it yesterday evening. From 10 o'clock in the morning till sunset, our people took the ship in the end, but I wasn't there. The Lord Bar himself had been killed in the battle, but one of his men said that, early in the morning, as soon as he saw he was certainly to be overhauled, Bar had given me to one of his knights and sent us both away on the ship's boat. And that boat was never seen again, but of course that was the same boat that Aslan, he seems to be at the back of all the stories, pushed ashore, and at the right place for Arish to pick me up. I wish I knew that knight's name, for he must have kept me alive and starved himself to do it. I suppose Aslan would say that was part of someone else's story, said Erebus. I was forgetting that, said Cor. And I wonder how the prophecy will work out, said Erebus, and what the great danger is that you're to save Archlin from. Well, said Cor rather awkwardly, they seem to think I've already done it. Erebus clapped her hands. Why, of course, she said, how stupid I am, and how wonderful. Archlin can never be in such greater danger than it was when Radbash had crossed the Arrow with his 200 horse, and hadn't yet got through with your message. Don't you feel proud? I think I feel a bit scared, said Cor. And you'll be living in Anvard now, said Erebus rather wisely. Oh, said Cor, I'd nearly forgotten what I came about. Father wants you to come and live with us. He says that there's been no lady in the court, they call it the court, and I don't know why, since Mother died. Do, Erebus. You'll like Father. And Corin. They're not like me. They've been properly brought up. You needn't be afraid of that. Oh, stop it, said Erebus, or we'll have a real fight. Of course I'll come. Now let's go and see the horses, said Cor. But there was a great and joyous meeting between Bree and Cor, and Bree, who was still in a rather subdued frame of mind, agreed to set out for Anvard at once. He and Hwin would cross into Narnia on the following day. All four bade an affectionate farewell to the hermit, and promised that they would soon visit him again. But about the middle of the morning they were on their way. The horses had expected that Erebus and Cor would ride, but Cor explained that except in war, where everyone must do what he can do best, no one in Narnia or Archlin ever dreamed of mounting a talking horse. This reminded poor Bree again of how little she knew about Narnian customs, and what dreadful mistakes he might make. So while Hwin strolled along in a happy dream, Bree got more nervous and more self-conscious with every step he took. Buck up, Bree, said Cor. It's far worse for me than for you. You aren't going to be educated. I shall be learning reading and writing and heraldry and dancing and history and music, while you'll be galloping and rolling on the hills of Narnia to your heart's content. But that's just the point, groaned Bree. Do talking horses roll? Suppose they don't. I can't bear to give it up. What do you think, Hwin? I'm going to roll anyway, said Hwin. I don't suppose any of them would care 2 lumps of sugar whether you roll or not. Are we near that castle? Said Bree to Cor. Round the next bend, said the prince. Well, said Bree, I'm going to have a good one now. It may be the last. Wait for me a minute. It was 5 minutes before he rose again, blowing hard and covered with bits of bracken. Now I'm ready, he said in the voice of a profound gloom. Lead on, Prince Cor, Narnia in the north. But he looked more like a horse going to a funeral than a long-lost captive returning to home and freedom. Chapter 15. Rabadash the Ridiculous. The next turn of the road brought them out from among the trees, and there, across the green lawns, sheltered from the north wind by the high wooded ridge at its back, they saw the castle of Anvard. It was very old, and built of a warm reddish-brown stone. Before they had reached the gate, King Lune came out to meet them, not looking at all like Arvidus's idea of a king, and wearing the oldest of old clothes, for he had just come from making a round of the kennels with his huntsman, and had only stopped for a moment to wash his doggy hands. But the bow with which he had greeted Arvis as he took her hand would have been stately enough for an emperor. "Little lady," he said, "we bid you a very heartily welcome. If my dear wife were still alive, we could make you a better cheer, but could not do it with a better will. And I'm sorry that you have had misfortunes and have been driven from your father's house, which cannot be but a grief to you. My son Cor told me about your adventures together and all your valor." "It was he who did all that, sir," said Aravis. "Why, he rushed at a lion to save me." "Eh, what's that?" said King Lune, his face brightening. "I haven't heard that part of the story." Then Aravis told it, and Cor, who had very much wanted the story to be known, though he felt he couldn't tell it himself, didn't enjoy it so much as he had expected, and indeed felt rather foolish. But his father enjoyed it very much indeed, and in the course of the next few weeks told it to so many people that Cor wished it had never happened. Then the king turned toward Hwin and Bree, and was just as polite to them as to Aravis, and asked them a lot of questions about their families and where they had lived in Narnia before they had been captured. The horses were rather tongue-tied, for they weren't yet used to being talked to as equals by humans. Grown-up humans, that is. They didn't mind Aravis and Cor. Presently Queen Lucy came out from the castle and joined them, and King Lune said to Aravis, "My dear, here's a loving friend of our house, and she has been seeing that your apartments are put to rights for you better than I could have done it." "You'd like to come and see them, wouldn't you?" said Lucy, kissing Aravis. They liked each other at once, and soon they went away together to talk about Aravis's bedroom and Aravis's boudoir, and about getting clothes for her, and all the sorts of things girls do talk about on such an occasion. After lunch, which they had on the terrace, it was cold birds and cold game pie and wine and bread and cheese. King Lune ruffled up his brow and heaved a sigh, and said, "Hi ho! We still have that sorry creature Radabash on our hands, my friends, and we must needs resolve what to do with him." Lucy was sitting on the king's right, and Aravis on his left. King Edmund sat on one end of the table, and the Lord Darn faced him at the other. Dar and Peridin and Corin were on the same side as the king. "Your Majesty would have a perfect right to strike off his head," said Peridin. "Such an assault he has made puts him on a level with an assassin." "It is very true," said Edmund, "but even a traitor may mend. I have known one that did," and he looked very thoughtful. "To kill this Radbash would go near to raising war with Tisroc," said Darin. "A fig for the Tisroc," said King Lune. "His strength is in numbers, and numbers will never cross the desert. But I have no stomach for killing men, even traitors, in cold blood. To have cut his throat in battle would have eased my heart mightily, but this is a different thing." "By my counsel," said Lucy, "your Majesty shall give him another trial. Let him go free on straight promise of fair dealings in the future. It may be that he will keep his word." "Maybe apes will grow honest, sister," said Edmund. "But, by the lion, if he breaks it again, may it be in such time and place that any of us could swap off his head in clean battle." "It shall be tried," said the king, and then to one of the attendants, "Send for the prisoner, friend." Radbash was brought before them in chains. To look at him, anyone would have supposed that he had passed the night in a noisome dungeon, without food or water, but in reality he had been shut up in a quite comfortable room, and provided with an excellent supper. But as he was sulking far too furiously to touch the supper, and had spent the whole night stamping and roaring and cursing, he naturally did not know how to look his best. "Your Royal Highness needs not be told," said King Lune, "that by the law of the nations, as well as by all reasons of prudent policy, we have as good right to your head as ever one mortal man had against another. Nevertheless, in consideration of your youth and the ill nurture, devoid of all gentleness and courtesy, which you have doubtlessly had in the land of slaves and tyrants, we are disposed to set you free, unharmed, on these conditions. First that— Curse you for a barbarian dog, splurted Radbash. Do you think I will even hear your conditions? Ha! You have very largely of nurture, and I know not of what. It's easy to a man in chains. Ha! Take off these vile bonds, give me a sword, and let any of you who dares then debate with me. Nearly all the lords sprang to their feet, and Corin shouted, Father, can I box him, please? Peace, your majesties. My lords, said King Lune, we have no more gravity among us than to be so chafed by the taunt of the Padjot. Sit down, Corin, or shout and leave the table. I ask your highness again to hear our conditions. I hear no conditions from barbarians and sorcerers, said Radbash. Not one of you dare touch a hair on my head. Every insult you have heaped on me shall be paid with oceans of Narnian and Archean blood. Terrible shall the vengeance of the Tisroc be, even now. But kill me, and the burnings and torturings in these northern lands shall become a tale to frighten the world 1,000 years hence. Beware, 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 the bolt of Tash falls from above. Does it ever get caught on a hook halfway? Said Corin. Shame, Corin, said the king. Never taunt a man save when he's stronger than you. Then, as you please. Oh, you foolish Radbash, sighed Lucy. Next moment, Cor wondered why everyone at the table had risen and was standing perfectly still. Of course he did the same himself, and then he saw the reason. Aslan was among them, though no one had seen him coming. Radbash stared as the immense shape of the lion paced softly in between him and the accusers. Rabadash, said Aslan, take heed. Your doom is very near, but you may still avoid it. Forget your pride and what you have to be proud of, and your anger, who has done you wrong, and accept the mercy of these good kings. Then Rabadash rolled his eyes and spread out his mouth in a horrible, long, mirthless grin like a shark, and wagged his ears up and down. Anyone could learn how to do this if they take the trouble. He had always found this very effective in Calmarin. The bravest had trembled when he made these faces, and ordinary people had fallen to the floor, and sensitive people have often fainted. But what Rabadash hadn't realized is that it is very easy to frighten people who know you can have them boiled alive the moment you give the word. The grimaces didn't look at all alarming in Archland. Indeed, Lucy only thought Rabadash was going to be sick. Demon, 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 shrieked the prince. I know you. You are the foul fiend of Narnia. You are the enemy of the gods. Learn who I am, a horrible phantasm. I am descended from Tash, the inexorable, the irresistible. The curse of Tash is upon you. Lightning in the shape of scorpions shall be rained on you. The mountains of Narnia shall be ground into dust. Have care, Rabadash, said Aslan quietly. The doom is nearer now. It is at the door. It has lifted the latch. Let the skies fall, shrieked Rabadash. Let the earth gape. Let blood and fire obliterate the world. But be sure I will never desist until I have dragged to my palace by her hair the barbarian queen, the daughter of the dogs. The hour has struck, said Aslan, and Rabadash saw, to his supreme horror, that everyone had begun to laugh. They couldn't help it. Rabadash had been wagging his ears all the time, and as soon as Aslan said, the hour has struck, the ears began to change. They grew longer and more pointed, and soon were covered with gray hair. And while everyone was wondering where they had seen ears like that before, Rabadash's face began to change too. It grew longer and thicker at the top, and larger eyes, and the nose sank back into the face, or else the face swelled out and became all nose. And there was hair all over it, and his arms grew longer and came down in front of him until his hands were resting on the ground. Only they weren't hands now. They were hoofs, and he was standing on all fours, and his clothes disappeared, and everyone laughed louder and louder, because they couldn't help it, for now what had been Rabadash was, simply and unmistakably, a donkey. The terrible thing that was his human speech lasted just a moment longer than his human shape, so that when he realized a change was coming over him, he screamed out, "Oh, not a donkey, mercy! For if it were even a horse, and a and so the words died away into a donkey's bray. "Now hear me, Rabadash," said Aslan. "Justice shall be mixed with mercy. You shall not always be an ass." Of course, the donkey twitched its ears forward, and that also was so funny that everybody laughed all the more. They tried not to, but they tried in vain. "You have appealed to Tash," said Aslan, "and in the temple of Tash you shall be healed. You must stand before the altar of Tash in Tashbaan at the great autumn feast this year, and there in the sight of all Tashbaan your ass's shape will fall from you, and all men will know you for Prince Rabadash. But as long as you live, if ever you go more than 10 miles away from the great temple in Tashbaan, you shall instantly become again as you are now, and from that second change there will be no return." There was a short silence, and they all stirred and looked at one another as if they were waking from sleep. Aslan was gone, but there was a brightness in the air and on the grass and joy in their hearts, which assured them that he had been no dream, and anyway, there was the donkey in front of them. King Loon was the kindest-hearted of men, and of seeing his enemy in this regrettable condition, he forgot all his anger. "Your Royal Highness," he said, "I am most truly sorry that things have come to this extremity. Your Highness will bear witness that it was none of our doing, and of course we shall be delighted to provide your Highness with a shipping back to Tashbaan for the treatment which Aslan has prescribed. You shall have every comfort which your Highness's situation allows, the best of the cattle boats, the freshest carrots and thistles." But a deafening bray come from the donkey, and a well-aimed kick at one of the guards made it clear that these kindly offers were ungratefully received. And here, to get him out of the way, I better finish off the story of Rabadash. He, or it, was duly sent back to Tashbaan, and brought to the temple of Tash at the great autumn festival, and then he became a man again. But of course 4,000 or 5,000 people had seen the transformation, and the fair could not possibly be hushed up. And after the old Tisroc's death, when Rabadash became Tisroc in his place, he turned out the most peaceable Tisroc Calormen ever known. This was because, not daring to go more than 10 miles from Tashbaan, he could never go on a war himself, and he didn't want his Tarkans to win fame in the wars at his expense, for that was the way Tisrocs get overthrown. But though his reasons were selfish, it made things much more comfortable in all the smaller countries round Calormen. His own people never forgot that he had been a donkey during his reign, and to his face he was called Rabadash the Peacemaker, but after his death and behind his back he was called Rabadash the Ridiculous, and if you look him up in history of Calormen, try the local library, you will find him under that name. And to this day, in Calormen schools, if you do anything unusually stupid, you are very likely to be called a second Rabadash. Meanwhile, at Anvard, everyone was very glad that he had been disposed of before the real fun began, which was the grand feast held that evening on the lawn before the castle, with dozens of lanterns to help the moonlight. And the wine flowed, and the tales were told, and jokes were cracked, and then silence was made, and the king's poet with 2 fiddlers stepped out into the middle of the circle. Aravis and Cor prepared themselves to be bored, for the only poetry they knew was the Calormen kind, and you know what kind that is like. But at the first scrape of the fiddlers, a rocket seemed to go up inside their heads, and the poet sang the great old lay, Fair Olven, and how he fought the great Peer, and turned him into stone. And that is the origin of Mount Peer. It was 2-headed giant, and won the Lady Lynn for his bride. and when it was over they wished it was going to begin again. And though Bree couldn't sing, he told the story of the fight of Zalandray, and Lucy told again. They had all, except Erebus and Cor, heard it many times, but they all wanted it again. The tale of the wardrobe, and how she and King Edmund and Queen Susan and Peter the High King had first come into Narnia. And presently, as was certain to happen sooner or later, King Lune said it was time for the young people to be in bed. And tomorrow, Cor, he added, shall come over all the castle with me and see the and marks all the strength and weaknesses, for it will be thine to guard when I'm gone. But Corin will be the king then, father, said Cor. Nay, lad, said King Lune, thou art my heir, the crown comes to thee. But I don't want it, said Cor. I'd far rather. 'Tis no question what thou wantest, Cor, nor I either. 'Tis the course of the law. But if we're twins, we must be the same age. Nay, said the king with a laugh, one must come first. Art Corin's elder by full 20 minutes, and is better too. Let's hope, though, that's no great mastery. And he looked at Corin with a twinkle in his eyes. But, father, couldn't you make whichever you like to be the next king? No, the king's under the law, for it's the law makes him a king. Hast no more power to start away from thy crown than any sentry from his post. Oh dear, said Cor, I don't want to at all. And Corin, I am most dreadfully sorry. I never dreamed my turning up and going to chisel you out of your kingdom. Hurrah, hurrah, said Corin, I shan't have to be king. I shan't have to be king. I always wanted to be a prince. It's princes that have all the fun. And that's truer than thy brother knows, Cor, said King Lune. For this is what it means to be a king. To be first in every desperate attack, and last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, and must be now and then in bad years, to wear finer clothes and to laugh louder over a scantier meal than any man in your land. When the two boys were going upstairs to bed, Cor again asked Corin if nothing could be done about it, and Corin said, If you say another word about it, I'll knock you down. It would be nice to end the story by saying that after the two brothers never disagreed about anything again, but I'm afraid it would not be true. In reality, they quarreled and fought just about as often as any other two boys would, and all their fights ended, if they didn't begin, with Cor getting knocked down. For though, when they had both grown up and become swordsmen, Cor was the most dangerous man in the battle, neither he nor anyone else in North Countries could ever equal Corin as a boxer. That was first how he got his name, Corin Thunderfist, and how he performed his great exploit against the lapsed bear of the Stormness, which was really a talking bear, but had gone back to the wild bear habits. Corin climbed up to its lair in the Narnian side of Stormness one winter's day, when the snow was on the hills, and boxed it without a timekeeper for 33 rounds, and at the end it couldn't see out of its eyes and became a reformed character. Erebus also had many quarrels, and I am afraid even fights with Cor, but they always made up again, so that years later, when they were grown up, they were so used to quarreling and making up again that they got married, so as to go on to doing it more conveniently. And after King Lune's death, they made a good king and queen of Archland, and Ram the Great, the most famous of all the kings in Archenland, was their son. Bree and Hwin lived happily to a great age in Narnia, and both got married, but not to one another. And there weren't many months in which one or both of them didn't become trotting over the paths to visit their friends at Anbard. The end.